Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today I want to talk about two of my favorite early spring power fishing techniques. That's both the lipless crankbait as well as a shallow running crankbait. And I want to talk about when I like to use one versus the other because honestly, they are pretty interchangeable baits, but there is a specific time and place where I think that the crank will outperform the lipless and then vice versa as well. So we're going to get into that. First, I want to give a big shout out to my buddy Matthew Stockton, who helped design my smallmouth bass logo, because today's sweatshirt is his. It's the Crank-A-Tank sweatshirt. I just got it in the mail. It's an awesome sweatshirt. I love it. If you haven't seen his stuff, go check it out. His Instagram account and all that. I'll put the link in the video description so you can see his work, but it's amazing. He does stuff for Sims. He does separate t-shirts on the side and all kinds of stuff. Just an amazing artist, if you ask me. Also, guys, I want to point out that if you want to support the channel, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link when making tackle purchases. The little bit I make from that comes right back to producing content for you guys. And hopefully tips like today's are helpful. So, I'm getting ready to head to South Carolina to fish Clarks Hill Lake. There's a lot of shallow flats in that lake, a lot of rock banks, a lot of rock transition, channel swing, a lot of stumps, a lot of isolated rock. Just, it screams to me to be throwing either a lipless or a shallow crank. Now, I get a lot of questions from people who want to know specifically, when do you throw one versus the other? Because I do feel like you can have an advantage over the other by using it under these certain circumstances. So the first thing I'm going to point out with your lipless, the most obvious difference between the two baits is your lipless sinks, your crankbait floats, right? So that's going to be one of the biggest issues to determining when I want to use a bait. The other is going to be weather conditions. So let's just talk about the lipless to begin with. A lipless to me is a phenomenal bait at covering water, but I like it better when I'm covering water that doesn't have many depth changes. So I'm going to be using it more on my flat banks. Now that could be throwing to the bank and working back to the boat. It could be fan casting in an open pocket in the back, but generally speaking, I like there to not be much depth change, meaning, maybe the entire flat that I'm fan casting is 4 feet deep. And the reason for that is the lipless will maintain its depth better than the crankbait, meaning the crankbait is always trying to dive deeper. In a lot of scenarios, I don't want my bait to dive deeper, especially if I'm fishing a very shallow flat. If I'm only in 2 or 3 feet of water, I'd rather keep my bait above the bass's heads than digging through the bottom, which a lot of times those flats you're going to be talking about are sand and silt, maybe mud, maybe clay. And your crankbaits are actually going to get balled up and not work as well through those areas. So I'd rather have a bait that I can maintain a consistent depth with and keep off the bottom in those super shallow flats. Now, having said that, if there's a ditch or a drain that runs through that flat, so maybe the flat's 2 feet deep and then you've got a defined ditch that's maybe 4 feet deep, that's fine in terms of a depth change. I actually like that because then that gives the fish a target to hold on and it gives me a target to cast at. But in reality, I'd rather, again, not have my crankbait plowing through that flat, come off that ditch, and then dive to the bottom of the ditch. Since that ditch or that drain's only a foot, maybe 2 foot difference, I'd rather have a bait still go above their head. And that's where I'm really gonna like the lipless. Now, I'll also add, if I'm fishing areas that have a ton of bait fish, again, I'd rather go with a lipless presentation because the lipless bait will stay up where the bait fish are. If you're fishing a flat that's maybe 6, 8 foot of water and the bait fish are swimming around 4 feet off the bottom, I'd rather keep my bait in the bait fish versus under the bait fish. Even though the bass are probably going to be under the bait fish, they're going to be looking up to feed, and therefore I want my bait coming across the top. So that's a big difference for me as well. If I'm fishing an area that's got a lot of bait, I a lot of times will tend to go with a lipless crank over, say, a square bill crank or a shallow running crank. Along with that same theory, if you have a lot of bait fish around, a lot of times that's when you're talking about your schooling fish, I'd rather be throwing a lipless crankbait that I can cover water faster with, make longer casts, and just generally get better strikes from schooling fish than I will with a crankbait, which may at times be diving under the fish when they're feeding up. They're going to be pushing those bait fish to the surface to trap the bait fish, and therefore I'd rather have a lipless that I can keep up higher in the water column if I want to. Uh, Lastly, the biggest difference with this too comes down to what type of day is it? If I've got a warm spring day in the spring, a lot of times what happens is those fish will move away from isolated cover and start roaming some of those spawning flats. When that happens, I can be more efficient by covering those areas with a lipless crank than I will be with a shallow running crankbait. So on those warm, sunny spring pre-spawn days when the fish start spreading out, absorbing some of that sunlight, start moving around, a lipless crankbait can outproduce a shallow running crankbait in a lot of those instances. And one of the reasons for that is just the fact that the fish are going to be roaming around. There's no specific strike zone, so you need to make more fan casts. You're going to be just making more random casts. And at that point, the lipless has more drawing power and is better off in terms of covering water. So those are kind of the times when I like to throw a lipless like this Berkeley War Pig. But when I switch over to a shallow running crankbait like this Berkeley Fritz side, what I'm going to be looking for are a lot of the opposites of those scenarios, meaning one of the biggest keys is going to be the targets that I'm fishing. With a lipless, I may be fan casting a flat. With a crankbait, I'm going to be trying to come in contact with specific targets. Could be a stump, could be a lay down tree, could be an isolated rock pile, maybe a boulder, maybe a rock transition. I'm going to make a lot of repeated casts to the same places because I know that the fish are going to be holding in certain targets. And when I hit it, I can stop my bait and let it slowly rise to the surface, which is a very good way to trigger strikes. So that's really good from a pre-spawn standpoint. But as soon as fish start thinking about spawning as well, if they're spawning by, say, a stump, if I bring my lipless crankbait right past there, I don't have any opportunity truly to stop the bait. If I bring a shallow running crankbait, bump the stump, let it start floating up, my bait stays in the strike zone of where that fish is thinking about or has a bed, and therefore I'll generate more strikes on this. So the closer I'm getting to the spawn, the more I definitely want to start going with a shallow running crankbait. So that's the first thing. If I'm fishing specific targets, I'd much rather be fishing the crankbait. The next up would have to do with the bank that I'm fishing. If it's more vertical, and a lot of times in the springtime, we like to fish 45-degree banks because we're fishing channel swings, rock transitions, places that the fish are moving from wintering areas to spawning pockets, which are going to be more of those travel routes and therefore more vertical bank. That's when I definitely would rather go with a shallow running crankbait because I need my bait to come down that bank and get a little bit more depth. The fish are generally going to be holding tighter to that shoreline, and therefore, again, that's where a crankbait comes in. It's just more productive than your lipless baits. The next would have to do with bait fish. As soon as that water temperature starts getting up into that 55-degree range, bait fish are no longer just the primary food source for the bass. They start feeding more on crayfish, which brings them tighter to the rock. And therefore, again, your crankbait's going to be key because you're working tighter to the bank, which is just something that seems to generate more strikes. So if you're thinking about fishing a lipless versus a crankbait, these are some of the things to keep in mind. The last thing I'll point out too is if you have cold front days in the spring months, again, your lipless or your shallow running crankbait will probably outperform your lipless because the fish aren't going to be roaming those flats. They will be tighter to the cover because the cover is retaining heat and it's giving them an area to kind of sit and rest up during the front that's passing. And therefore, if you can, bounce a crankbait off of some of those targets, they tend to perform better during your cooler mornings and your cold front days that you get during the spring. So these are the times when I like to use both. Now, honestly, guys, I got to tell you, if I'm fishing a place that's got a good crankbait or lipless crankbait bite, I've probably got both rigged. I'm just changing from one to the other as I hit the type of water that I want to throw a lipless in versus when I want to throw a shallow running crank. They both are phenomenal fish catching tools, especially during the pre-spawn and into the spawn time. So do not put them away. This is the time to get them out, to use them to catch some fish, and they catch big fish as well. So hopefully you found this useful. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new tip video for you tomorrow.